For 10 years, they tried to become the next Emirates. They bought minority stakes in struggling airlines on 3 continents. They built one of the most luxurious cabins ever to fly through the sky. They placed what was, at the time, the largest aircraft order in aviation history. And by doing all this, they lost close to $5 billion in the process. Today, that same airline holds the highest credit rating of any airline on Earth. Its profit margin runs at more than double the global industry average, with a load factor sitting at almost 89%. Its fleet just hit 127 aircraft, the largest in its history. And it was weeks away from one of the most anticipated public listings the Gulf has seen in nearly 2 decades. The airline is Etihad Airways. The year is 2026. And in late February of that year, missiles started falling on the airport it calls home.
In Abu Dhabi, officials reported an explosion at Zayed International Airport.
This is the story of how the most ambitious airline in the Gulf became the most disciplined one, and why the next months will decide whether that discipline was actually worth anything. As always, we have to go back in time to the very beginning of Etihad. The story of Etihad began in 2003. The Middle East had one regional flag carrier connecting the Gulf to Europe and Asia, and it was called Gulf Air. Bahrain owned a piece, Oman owned a piece, Qatar owned a piece, and Abu Dhabi owned a piece. Qatar Airways had already existed since 1993, but Qatar only fully committed to it in 2002, when it pulled out of Gulf Air to focus on building its own national carrier. A year later, Sheikh Ahmed bin Saif Al Nahyan founded Etihad Airways from scratch. This timing matters more than people realize. Emirates had already been flying for 18 years. Qatar Airways had been flying for nearly a decade. Both had spent that time building route networks, training crew, and embedding themselves into the global travel industry. Etihad was launching from zero, and it was launching from a city that was not the natural choice for connecting traffic between Europe, Asia, and Africa. That last point is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Abu Dhabi is not Dubai. Dubai had engineered itself into a global tourism and business magnet over decades. It had the hotels, the malls, the brand recognition, and the inbound demand that made Emirates a household name in 50 different countries. Abu Dhabi had oil, ambition, and a sovereign wealth fund. What it did not have was a natural pull factor. So Etihad's leadership faced a brutal question. How do you build a top 3 global airline from a city most international travelers cannot find on a map against rivals with a 20-year head start? The answer Etihad chose would haunt the company for the next decade. The man who made the decision was James Hogan, an Australian aviation executive who took over as chief executive in 2006. His logic was straightforward. Building a global network organically would take 20 years. There was only one little problem. He did not have 20 years. So he decides that instead of building a network, he would buy one. The strategy was called the Equity Alliance. Etihad would take minority stakes in airlines around the world, then use those airlines as a feeder system to push passengers through Abu Dhabi. The first investment came in late 2011, when Etihad acquired almost 30% of Air Berlin for around 73 million euros, plus a loan of close to 200 million more. Air Berlin, Germany's second largest carrier, was already losing money at an alarming rate. That set the template. Over the next 4 years, Etihad bought into Alitalia for around 560 million euros in exchange for 49% of the company. It bought 24% of India's Jet Airways for $379 million, plus another $220 million for their London Heathrow slots. It picked up roughly 21% of Virgin Australia. Smaller stakes followed in Air Seychelles, Aer Lingus, Air Serbia, and Darwin Airline in Switzerland. That last one was rebranded as Etihad Regional in March of 2014. The airline established its Airline Alliance, Etihad Airways Partners, in October 2015. But every one of these airlines was struggling, and that was actually the whole point. Etihad could buy in cheaply because they needed cash. In practice, every single one of these carriers was struggling for reasons no amount of cash could solve. Alitalia had union agreements that had defeated every previous restructuring attempt. Air Berlin was being squeezed between Ryanair and EasyJet on the low end and Lufthansa on the high end, and Jet Airways could simply not compete with Indigo's relentless low-cost model in India. These were not capital problems, they were structural ones. And then there was the ownership flaw. 29% here, 49% there. Minority stakes meant Etihad absorbed the losses without ever having the power to make the changes the partners actually needed. By contrast, Lufthansa Group owned controlling stakes in Swiss, Austrian, and Brussels Airlines. Lufthansa could simply force decisions onto its partners. Etihad had to negotiate, persuade, and watch its money burn. In May of 2016, the management structure was reshuffled as Hogan became CEO of the airline's parent company, Etihad Aviation Group. Peter Baumgartner, formerly the airline's chief commercial officer, became chief executive officer of the airline, reporting to Hogan. In December of 2016, Handelsblatt Global reported that Hogan was expected to be dismissed after a failed spree of acquisitions in Europe. On the 24th of January 2017, the Etihad Aviation Group Board of Directors announced that Hogan, along with Group CFO James Ring, would be stepping down in the second half of that year. Peter Baumgartner became the acting CEO as it faced mounting losses from its investments in Air Berlin and Alitalia. On the 2nd of May 2017, Alitalia filed for bankruptcy. Hogan and Rigney left Etihad later that month. On July 27th of 2017, Etihad reported a loss of $1.87 billion for financial year 2016. On the 15th of August 2017, Air Berlin filed for bankruptcy after Etihad withdrew its financial support. As a result of this, the Air Berlin administrator sued them for 2 billion euros. The Etihad Aviation Group ceased operations in 2018. Now we get to the part of the story almost nobody covers: the recovery. When the new leadership team took over, first under British executive Tony Douglas in 2018, and then under Brazilian executive Antonoaldo Neves from late 2022, they did something that should have been obvious, but somehow was not. They did the opposite of everything Hogan had done. The first move was to admit a hard truth. Etihad could never be Emirates, and it could not be Qatar Airways. It was based in a smaller emirate with a smaller catchment area with fewer natural connecting flows. Trying to compete on scale was the original sin. So Etihad eventually stopped trying. In February of 2019, they canceled aircraft orders. 42 Airbus A350-900s and 2-1000 were canceled. They reduced the Boeing 777X from 24 to only 5. They grounded the entire Airbus A380 fleet, sold the Equity Alliance stakes that still had value, and slashed the route network from a global superconnector to a focused premium carrier serving Abu Dhabi. Then COVID arrived and made everything 10 times worse. Passenger numbers fell 76%. Most airlines this small, with this much existing debt, would have collapsed. Etihad did not. The discipline that the new leadership had imposed during the contraction became the foundation of a different kind of airline entirely. What emerged was something almost unique in modern aviation. A boutique premium carrier was born. Not the biggest, not even trying to be. Smaller fleet, smaller network, higher margins per seat. A cabin product better than the size of the airline should be able to justify. Here is where I want you to stop and ask yourself a question. Did Etihad actually win, or did it just give up? Because the comparison is a tiny bit uncomfortable. Emirates today carries more than 55 million passengers a year out of Dubai International, with a fleet that includes more Airbus A380 Super Jumbos than anyone else. Qatar Airways operates a global network of over 150 destinations. And then there was Etihad, that carries 22 million passengers from a hub most international travelers still cannot place on a map. If you measure success by scale, Etihad lost the Gulf airline war years ago. But if you measure it by profitability per aircraft, the picture changes entirely. Let's take a look at what 2025 actually delivered. Etihad reported a full year profit of $698 million, up 47% year over year. Revenue hit $8.4 billion, up 21%. The airline carried 22.4 million passengers, also up 21%. Load factor reached 88.3%. Profit margin landed at 8.4%. That last number needs context to mean anything. The global airline industry, according to data from the International Air Transport Association, ran at a net profit margin of around 3.9% in 2025. Etihad's margin was more than double that. The airline was not just profitable, it was exceptionally profitable for the industry it operates in. Cash generation hit almost $2 billion in operating cash flow. That let the company fully fund its capital expenditure for the year while still paying down debt. In December of 2025, Fitch upgraded the airline's credit rating to AA-, the highest publicly available rating for any airline anywhere on the planet. The fleet grew to 127 aircraft after 29 new additions in a single year. The network expanded from 94 to 110 destinations. New routes launched to Atlanta, Prague, Warsaw, Hong Kong, Hanoi, Addis Ababa, and a string of other markets. The airline had committed to investing $10 billion in new aircraft over the next 5 years, including Airbus A350-1000s, A330neos, Boeing 787-9s and -10s, and the Airbus A321LR, a narrow body fitted with 2 first-class suites and lie-flat business seats. That last aircraft is unusual because almost no airline puts true premium product on a narrow body. Etihad did. Why? Because it could. The growth target was 38 million passengers by the end of the decade, with a fleet of more than 200 aircraft. And the airline was preparing a $1 billion initial public offering, the most anticipated Gulf airline listing in nearly 2 decades. Citigroup, HSBC, and First Abu Dhabi Bank were lined up as lead advisors. The path looked clear. Until February 28th of 2026 arrived. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. Within hours, the airspace above the entire Gulf region closed. Operation Epic Fury, as the campaign came to be called, escalated faster than anyone had predicted. Abu Dhabi's Zayed International Airport, Etihad's home base, took direct hits. Multiple drones and missiles either reached the airport or were intercepted just short of it. Every Etihad flight was suspended. Together, Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways carry roughly 1/3 of all passenger traffic between Europe and Asia, and more than half of all passengers between Europe and Australia. When all 3 stop flying at once, a meaningful chunk of global long-haul connectivity simply ceases to exist. By mid-March, both Emirates and Etihad had clawed back to around 90% of their pre-war networks. But demand cratered. By late April, Etihad was operating roughly 92 flights a day from Abu Dhabi, somewhere between 60 and 80% of its pre-war capacity, depending on which week you measured. The airline cut fares by up to 50% on some routes to keep aircraft full. Business class from London to Sydney appeared at under $3,500. Etihad lowered loyalty tier qualification requirements by 25% through March of 2027. A rival Gulf executive reportedly described the pricing strategy as moves that cheapen the brand. Etihad's defenders compared it to the deep discounting American carriers used after September 11th to rebuild passenger confidence. The United Arab Emirates airspace officially reopened on May 2nd of 2026. 2 days later, on May 4th, fresh missile activity prompted brief delays and rerouted flights again. As of mid-May, the airline was still operating well below its pre-war schedule. The $1 billion initial public offering is on indefinite hold. Antonio Aldo Neves himself has said the airline does not need the proceeds, that it can list whenever conditions improve, that there is no rush. Whether that is strategic patience or quiet acknowledgement that the market conditions for a Gulf airline listing have fundamentally changed is something only the next few months will answer. So here is why I thought Etihad's story is actually worth telling this way. The first chapter, the Equity Alliance years, is what almost every analysis of this airline focuses on. The failure, the losses, the bankruptcies of its partners, the wasted billions. That chapter is well documented. But the second chapter, the one where the airline systematically tore down its own ambitions and rebuilt itself as something smaller, calmer, and more profitable, is the part almost no one talks about. And the third chapter, the war, is so fresh that nobody yet knows how to interpret. Etihad's defining decision was not the equity alliance. It was the decision to stop pretending, to accept that Abu Dhabi was never going to be Dubai, to accept that a boutique premium carrier could be a better business than a half-built global superconnector. That kind of strategic humility is rare in aviation. It is almost unheard of in airlines backed by sovereign wealth funds, where political pride usually overrules financial logic. The question I want you to answer in the comments is this: has Etihad built something resilient enough to survive being tested twice? Or was the geography of Abu Dhabi always the risk that no strategy could ever fully hedge? If you have made it this far and you want to see what the Iran war is doing to the rest of global aviation, hit the like button and subscribe to Explained. The next few months are going to reshape this industry in ways nobody is ready for, and I want you here when it happens. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.